Tim Lawless, mate, Research Director over at CoreLogic. Mate, welcome back to the Scouting Australia podcast.
Thanks, Sam. It's hard to believe it's been a couple of months already, but a lot of water under the bridge since we chatted last.
There has been, mate. I'm really excited to get you on and chat. There's been a lot happening from a lot of different things in the property market and even with the interest rates and the economy and everything as well. So, mate, I know the listeners get very excited when you come in which you wouldn't think many people would from an economic perspective. But, mate, you keep it lighthearted and a lot of good information. So I got a lot of people writing in saying, make sure you get him on every interest rate meeting because, mate, all the gold that comes out, mate, we all love it. So, thanks for joining us, man.
Oh, good. Well, that's great to hear, mate. And I think last time we had a chat, I was kind of in the November camp for the next rate cut. To be honest, I think it's going to be a little bit later than that now.
That was the last question I was going to ask you today. Was are you still sitting in that park?
No, I think I'm now more of a February camp. So it's looking like pretty strong labour markets are going to be the sticking points. It's just low unemployment generally implies stronger wages growth, maybe a bit of upwards pressure on consumption, and just gets in the way of the RBA making a decision to cut rates, I think.
Yeah, 100%. Well, mate, let's dive into that. So the RBA meeting was earlier today, a couple of hours ago now, on hold at the 4.35%. Did you want to dive through the minutes and what they went through there? And again, that was actually one of the big things I was going to ask you. I was been hearing about the labour markets holding firm and even comparing us to other countries and economies. But, mate, the minutes from the RBA, what's your takeaways from it?
Yeah. Well, it was the statement. We'll see the minutes in a few weeks. But, the minutes basically were much of the same as what we've seen through the past couple of meetings. So obviously rates unchanged. The RBA's pretty much stuck to their mantra of inflation's higher than what they're comfortable with, even though it's trending lower. And they've been very clear that they do expect headline inflation to come down into the target range pretty soon. But that's very much a mechanical side effect of energy rebates. So, and they're very clear as well. They're going to be focusing much more on the underlying core inflation measures. So the trimmed mean would be the key one to watch there, which is going to be a little bit stickier. That won't be impacted by energy rebates and still probably held higher by just services inflation holding pretty high. The RBA did call out a few of the other, Western nations have been on a cutting cycle now, but it's very, it's really important to point out Australia's quite different, right? We started later in our hiking cycle, so there's a bit of a lag on a monetary policy. We didn't go as hard as a lot of other Western nations as well. Like look at the US, they went up 525 basis points, so 100 more than Australia did. The UK went up 515. New Zealand was up 525 points as well. So we haven't gone as hard as a lot of other countries. And there's also this other argument that monetary policy in Australia probably has a quicker transmission mechanism into household balance sheets, given most of us are on variable interest rates for our mortgages as well. So all those things add up to, I think the RBA is going to be on hold. They're pretty comfortable to, watch the data. Markets are definitely in the February camp now. They sort of flick back and forth between December and February. And the big four banking economists are sort of split between December, that's CBA, out to May, which is NAB, and ANZ and Westpac both on February as well. So I think that really just highlights the uncertainty on where interest rates are going. But the clear thing is, I think the next movement in rates is going to be downwards. It's just about the timing and then the speed of decline.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny, right? Because Michelle Bullock, that last time round, she was adamant that it wasn't coming down this year. So it's interesting to see someone as big as a CBA still holding firm that they still think it's going to come this year. Why do you think that is? I'm curious to see your thoughts on that when they've been so bullishly saying it's not going to be this year.
Yeah, well, they've pushed their forecast from November to December now, so
Okay.
they have slipped a little bit. And the reason they've pushed it back a month is simply because the high jobs numbers or high jobs growth, low unemployment is probably the main reason. But they see the fact that inflation's coming down into the target range, particularly headline inflation, even core inflation is trending lower, but not quite as quickly as the RBA might want. They also look at things like just the economy. Like GDP is still very weak. I mean, if you adjust for population growth, we've been in a per capita recession now for more than 6 quarters. Well, 6 quarters.
Interesting.
And consumption's very weak. So that's what CBA points to. Westpac and ANZ are in February camp. Should point to similar things. It's really just a matter of a month, right? So one meeting. So it's really neither here nor there. And I think regardless of which economic forecast you're tuning into, they're all agreed that the next move's down. It's really sometime probably in the first half of next year. Yeah, it would be.
Yeah, for sure. And there's been a lot of people, I guess, like carrying on a bit that like, well, all these other economies, these other economies in these other countries have started bringing it back down. Is that pure, like interest rates back down? Is that purely because they were higher and purely because their inflationary numbers have come back down? Or is there anything else outside of it? Like obviously saying, oh, we should be doing it because someone else is doing it when they're a completely different economy, obviously is different. But like, what's your take on that? Is it just like completely irrelevant what these other guys are doing?
No, it's really relevant.
Okay.
And I mean, the byproduct of the US coming down and Australia remaining high probably puts a little bit of upwards pressure on Australian currency, which in itself could be a good thing, right? That means there may be a little bit further downwards pressure on inflation because the cost of imported goods comes down. It's the main reason why we're seeing most of the other Western jurisdictions coming down is simply because they've got inflation much better under control than what we have. And that's probably a reflection of other Western economies just going harder on their cash rate hikes, starting earlier as well. Look at the EU; they started their cash rate hikes back in July of 2021.
Oh wow!
Nearly a whole year ahead of Australia. Yeah. So they're much more, I guess, ahead of the curve than we've gone a little bit more gently, and the RBA has been a little bit more patient, I suppose. But the byproduct of that is we're probably going to be in an environment where rates are higher for a bit longer.
Yep. Yeah. So they've done it early. These other economies have done it earlier. They've gone harder, and as such, they've been able to pull it back a bit sooner, right? So we've gone slower and a little bit easier. So it's going to be a slower and easier, probably lower easing cycle as well.
Yeah, and I mean, look at the jobs market, which has probably been tight on, surprising on the upside. That that can be a little bit of a sticking point for monetary policy. Remember, the RBA has two real, I guess, mandates. They've got keeping inflation between 2% and 3%, and also striving for full employment as well. So I think they've done a pretty good job on, quelling sort of inflation gradually, but also, most of the people that want a job have a job, and underemployment's very low, participation rates at a record high, unemployment's at 4.2%. There's solid jobs growth, so it's looking like a pretty solid labour force outcome.
It's an interesting thing as well. Hey, like they've got to try and keep that target band between 2 to 3%, but then also try and keep us at full employment, which at full employment is obviously going to get you wages growth as well, right? So it's an interesting thing on that front. Why are we so strong compared to so many economies out there in terms of that labor market? And just a little bit of insight, if you don't mind me sharing for a sec, like I've been tracking a lot of our markets lately that we're in, and so many of our markets we have unemployment rates sub 3%. All of them are sub 4%, but quite a lot of them are sub 3%. Some of them are even sub 2%. Like these are ridiculously tight, labor markets out there. Why is Australia so tight compared to so many of these other economies that are out there?
Yeah, a big part of our tightness in labour markets comes back to the public side of jobs. So public is simply government, right? So state or federal government or local government. There's a huge amount of big infrastructure projects underway. I've forgotten the ratio, but a higher than normal portion of jobs creation is going to the public sector as well. The strong jobs growth as well is a little bit skewed towards part-time jobs at the moment also. So that's probably another thing. You go back sort of 6 months to 12 months ago, it was definitely a story of full-time jobs growth. So a bit of yin and yang there. And the underemployment rate is holding very low. And you've got a record level participation rate. So people are out there looking for jobs. And you've even got nearly a record high number of or portion of workers are working more than one job. So the multiple jobs index is just off a record high. So I think that's probably a reflection of, just cost of living pressures being so significant. People are really just trying to do everything they can to make ends meet, to ensure they can buy essential items and keep on paying their debts.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to watch play out, hey? I'm, I'm curious of like kind of your thoughts as well with like, obviously the labor market staying so tight and jobs growth staying so strong. How are they going to like, are there any other levers you think they might pull, or is it just a matter of time before it still balances out and gets into the target range for inflation? But obviously this is going to take a bit longer because because the employment numbers are so strong and wages growth, wages are still growing at the moment.
Yeah, well, you have to think that naturally it will balance out, right? It's when you have relatively soft economic conditions, the private sector is going to be quite conservative and a little bit risk averse. So the public sector is another story. We're coming into, a state election in Queensland, federal election sometime next year. Public infrastructure projects are just going vertical in their spending. So that's probably the harder part to predict is when does public infrastructure or public spending start to wind back? It doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. But I think from a private sector perspective, given some of the uncertainty in the economy and just with GDP being quite weak and now overseas migration coming down, you'd have to think there's going to be, a stabilization in jobs growth across the private sector. And, look at the RBA forecasts for unemployment. They're expecting unemployment rate to be up sort of around 4.4% by the end of the year, currently at 4.2. I think that looks to be on track at the moment. And it should stabilize around that sort of mid fours through next year. Remember, the long-term average for unemployment is about 5.5%. So that's still a pretty low unemployment when you consider where we've come from.
Yeah, still a very strong labour market position, isn't it? That it's sitting. I remember I can't remember how many years ago it was now, but the norm for a while there was kind of like it was sitting like 7 or 8% for quite a few years. It's probably like mid 2010s or whatever it was. It's sitting there for quite a while, so it's very tight. Yeah, it's certainly the tightest it's been for a long time. Mate, talking about the immigration, if you don't mind, we kind of change tack and talk about that for a second. Like, what are you seeing now? Because obviously 12 months ago, that was one of the hottest topics in the country. Like, the immigration numbers were enormous. Effectively, it looked like they just kind of played catch up for what we missed out on during COVID. They played catch up, then they eased it back off. What are your thoughts on kind of future policies around immigration, or even what's in play at the moment, and how that may or may not affect the market?
Yeah, well, migration's clearly normalizing now. It's normalizing is a interesting term to use, I suppose, in the sense that it's coming down to maybe pre-COVID levels, which in itself was a pretty high level. So if you go back to sort of pre-2008, overseas migration was a lot lower, or pre-2007 was a lot lower. So we are still in a fairly high migration environment, and migration from overseas peaked in the first quarter of last year. It's been coming back. The net effect of that simply means that there's less rental demand coming into Australia. And we can clearly see that in our rental indices where, on our national index, July and August were both flat outcomes for rents. We haven't seen a flat rental index since the beginning of the pandemic back in the early 2020s. So I think it's pretty clear that as we see migration slowing down, there probably will be less rental demand. Couple that with pretty severe rental unaffordability, it makes sense that I think that the boom we've seen in rental markets is probably done, both from demand winding back due to less overseas migration, but also group households rebuilding, average household sizes becoming larger, and most households have been dedicating roughly around 30 to 33% of their incomes to paying rent. They just can't go any higher than that without structurally changing how many tenants are under the one roof, or younger folks staying at home with mum and dad longer, group households or multi-generational households reforming as well.
Yeah, it is an interesting time, mate, because we saw 2 to 3 years of like very, very rapid growth across a lot of markets from a rental growth perspective. To kind of watch it playing out, it's still growing, but it's at a lot lower pace than obviously what we have seen as well. So it's interesting. What about from the building sector? What are you seeing on that side as well? Build numbers and construction across the country? Is there anything in particular that's worrying you?
It's a pretty tough environment if you're a builder. Profit margins are still just compressed. It's pretty hard to turn a profit, especially in the multi-unit sector, so medium to high density.
Yep.
Approvals, they look like they've bottomed out and just starting to pick up a little bit now. But approvals is one thing. Having that translate to commencements and then completions is a completely different story. So I think for the next probably 18 to 24 months, we are going to be in this environment where we're not seeing a great deal of newly built stock coming to market.
Yep.
And even when commencements start to pick up, from there, it's still a good 18 to 24 months before you start to see that flow through to completions. So you'd have to think that this low, newly built housing supply scenario is going to be with us for some time. And the good side, I guess, or the silver lining of that means there's some support for housing prices for investors. But, the downside is it probably means that affordability constraints are going to become more challenging, that you probably see governments doubling down on trying to stimulate the sector. And eventually there's going to be a supply response, like guaranteed that it's going to, the pendulum will swing. And I think everyone just needs to be aware of that there will be a supply response. It'll probably come at a time when the demand side of the equation's eased off quite substantially. So
it's kind of got that time to catch up and then swing back in the other favour.
Exactly. Yeah, Australia's got a habit of sort of going too far on either side, especially in the multi-unit sector. So that's just one to watch out for down the track.
Yeah, almost try and catch up so much that then we just overshoot it, and then there's that oversupply on the back end as well.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of momentum behind construction, right? It just takes such a long time for stock to come into the marketplace, and once conditions are ripe, you'll probably find a lot of builders are becoming active at the same time. So, at a time when obviously migration's coming down and interest rates are going to be lower by then as well, which is probably a good thing. Yep.
If you were to kind of have mate, I'm putting you on the spot here, but if you could have a bit of a ballpark in terms of when you think that pendulum might swing back to the favor of not so much oversupply, but supply balance coming back into the market, whereas right now we have for a few years been sitting in that severe undersupply. And I know each region will be different, but if you could almost put a sort of a ballpark on that when it does play catch up and gets back in line, would you have a bit of a guess?
Have a bit of a stab. Yeah. Well, I think by the end of next year, we'll probably be in a market where capacity constraints have freed up somewhat. The stock that's been approved and been commenced, but hasn't been completed yet. So that I guess that late stage pipeline of supply is coming down now. So maybe a year from now, we're in a much better position for capacity for the sector to be delivering stock. Whether or not builders have been able to establish a premium for their stock that the market's going to tolerate by then, so a profit margin, is highly uncertain. We're still seeing construction costs rising at around 2.5% per annum. So that's pretty low in the grand scheme of things, but they're not going backwards. So I think that's probably going to be the wild card, is when do we actually move into an environment where builders can deliver stock to the marketplace that's going to give them a level of acceptable profit margin. I'm not too sure. Maybe that's aligning with sort of late next year or early 26. But like I said, even when you start to see that happening, there's still going to be a lag for the completion time to kick in. So I think
especially that multi-unit sector takes so long by the time you get your approvals and get it through and then finally get funding, by the time it actually takes to build it, especially a large project, it can be 2-3 years before people are moving in.
That's right. So say if I'm right and it's sort of late 2025, we start to see a little bit more activity picking up. You've still got probably another 18 months after that. So mid 26 to early 27, you're kind of looking at for a supply response. Remember the government's 1.2 million target. I mean, that finishes in 2019.
2029.
2029. Thank you, mate. Thanks. Doing the numbers in my head. You'd have to think there's going to be a mad scramble through the second half of that 5-year time frame to try and get even close to their target. But most people would appreciate it. We're probably going to get maybe to around 900,000, maybe a little bit more than that in that 1.2 million target. And the first half of that time frame probably won't have a great deal of supply being met.
Yeah, so you think sort of on the back end run of that, they'll be incentivizing and they'll doing everything they can to sort of get as much as they can to market and effectively to the public, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a lot of things that the industry talks about that could help speed up some supply response around, reducing infrastructure costs and charges, maybe reducing some of the barriers to foreign investment, that type of thing. Trying to get the build to rent legislation through the government as well would probably help. But I think in the broad scheme of things, you really need to have a loosening up of labour supply in the construction sector. It's a huge amount of big public infrastructure projects that's competing for the same materials and same labour force as well. So yeah, it's a complex environment. There's definitely no silver bullet here, but yeah, given that 1.2 million target and the incentives for the states, you'd have to think there's going to be some incentives introduced to the marketplace to help them achieve it.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Now, I appreciate the insights on it, mate. I've got one final question for you that I'm curious as to your opinion on this. We've been seeing fixed rates coming down more and more lenders starting to bring them down. I actually had my broker send me a snapshot today of 2 and 3 year fixed rates for investors coming back in at 5.5%, which is a pretty significant drop for investors, albeit it's P&I, but it's still a pretty decent drop for right now. Mate, what are your thoughts on? Obviously, we're probably going to see it coming in more and more, but what are your thoughts on it actually being an impact at all on the marketplace, seeing those start to come in? And as the rest of the year comes in, more and more fixed rates coming in lower and lower, what are your thoughts on impact on the market with those?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely seeing fixed rates coming down. Variable rates, what for investor on P&I are probably sort of mid to high sixes,
yes,
I guess. Yep. So that's, as you say, Sam, it's a pretty decent saving if you're getting in around the mid fives. But I kind of have a sneaking suspicion most are still going to opt for variable rates, hoping that you see variable rates coming down through next year and the year after that to something that's less than 5.5%.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think overall it gives you a bit of confidence that that banks are recognizing that we're done with the rate hiking cycle, that the next move is going to be down. I think that should help to just boost confidence. Just even inflation coming down and the cash rate being on hold should be enough to lift confidence a little bit, as well as alongside strong labour markets.
Yeah, for sure.
So overall, we know that sentiment is a really important feature of housing activity. And if sentiment does lift, then you'd have to expect that's going to flow through to a pickup in activity. The flip side of that argument still is affordability is pretty challenging. So if we see APRA dropping that 3 percentage point serviceability buffer down to say 2.5% and interest rates come down, that's where you'd probably start to see some more activity coming into the marketplace.
Yeah, for sure. What do you think is the likelihood of APRA changing that rate? They've held it there for quite a while, even with interest rates where they've been for the last 2 years, and they haven't moved it. What do you think the likelihood of that is? Because people have been talking about it for over 12 months. It's coming, and here we are. It's still not here.
I don't know. I think APRA would be quite cautious to reduce that 3 percentage point buffer.
I think so too.
I think think about the Council of Financial Regulators. That's APRA, ASIC, Treasury, and the RBA. I think they'd be quite dubious about trying to, boost or lift housing credit flows at a time when they're really trying to get inflation under control, and they'd be a little bit wary of a wealth effect kicking in. So, yeah, I wouldn't hold my breath for that 3 percentage point to drop back to 2.5. I mean, theoretically, as interest rates come down, it probably should get cut, but whether or not that'd be seen as a prudent move, I'll leave that up to the regulators.
It kind of makes sense, right? Like if they're gonna start dropping it, they may as well almost leave the buffer where it is, because if they don't want to drive further inflation and allow extra serviceability to come into the market, it kind of just makes sense to leave it where it is, right? Until things get back to a level of normality.
That's my gut feel. Yeah. I mean, remember, APRA's mandate is to ensure responsible lending and to maintain prudent lending standards. If you think about the level of investment in the marketplace at the moment, it's nearly 40% of mortgage demand at a time when yields are pretty low as well. So, yeah, I think they'll be watching the housing credit side of things pretty closely and probably be quite conservative.
Yeah, for sure. Mate, I agree with you on that one and on all of it. Actually, it was really good to get the insights as always, mate. So, yeah, thank you once again, Tim, mate, for joining us for the Scouting Australia podcast and the update that you always bring to us on interest rate day. So thank you very much.
Many thanks, Sam. See you next time.
Mate, thank you. See you then.